excuse me, got to remember where I'm at. For the South Kansas City and Grandview Chambers, the joint uh, Government Affairs Committee, we have with us this morning some elected officials. And but before we get to that, I do want to point out that on this Zoom, you can send us a question, and that way we can make sure that all of our participants or panelists can get your feedback and also answer some of your particular questions about what happened in the Missouri legislature this year, and what are we going to be seeing as we kind of move into the fall and also into 2021. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome uh, Representative Greg Razor. And Greg Razor represents the 25th district. And we also have with us Representative Mark Sharp representing the House 36th district, both representing South Kansas City area. Excuse me, Representative Greg Razor has, correct me if I'm wrong, Brookside, all down through Waldo into South Kansas City. Representative Mark Sharp has South Kansas City. And also with us is Representative Richard Brown. Representative Brown represents the 27th district, which has part of South Kansas City and Raytown. Representative Brown, please forgive me if I forgot another part of your district there. And last but surely not least, we have Representative Joe Runyons. Representative Runyons represents Grandview as his district. We're just going to have them talk about some priorities that were important to the chamber, to both chambers and to South Kansas City as a whole. And to help round out the panelist crew, we have our faithful lobbyists, Sammy Panettiere and Jamie LaFavre, to also add in their perspective as being lobbyists. They can see, well, a lot of things that are going on from more than one perspective, while the representatives are down there in the chamber in the fights. So, want to thank you all for participating this morning, both panelists and those of you that joined in on this Zoom webinar. And like I said, we're going to have a few moments here to let them speak. And then as you send in your questions, I'll be sifting through them, seeing if we have a lot of the same questions, and make sure that we can give them an opportunity to answer those questions as well. We have on with us the president of the South Kansas City Chamber, Vicki Wolgast, as well, and the president of the Grandview Chamber, Kim Curtis, with us as well. So if I miss anything, they will definitely jump in and help me out. But without further ado, I think we might go ahead and just jump right into the program and allow our representatives to start kind of talking about some of the issues that are important to them. And I know that Representative Razor, if you don't mind, we can have you batting lead off here and allow you a chance to kind of give us start the conversation off talking about some important issues around education. I know, especially with coronavirus, that changed some of the budget issues around education, higher ed. And so, Representative Razor.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning and for inviting us to be on. I think the way that this is going to be arranged today, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're each been kind of assigned kind of different areas of what we did during the legislative session, and I got the fun parts of the budget and education. And probably wise to put those two together because you can't really untie those two issues. So the budget this year, everything was kind of going through as normal. Of course, coronavirus then hit, and it pretty much decimated the state budget. So I think it's important to remember, and I'm going to try to do this quickly. Some of you have heard this before. When thinking of the Missouri state budget, there are kind of three pieces of pie. Generally speaking, the state budget is about $30 billion. Three separate pieces of pie, $10 billion each. One comes from the federal government. One is dedicated funds that can't be used for anything else. So think the gas tax. And then one is our income and sales tax. And that slice of pie is about $10 billion and pays for everything else. So that's where K-12 and higher ed education funding comes from, along with all of our social service programs and state employee pay and benefits, et cetera, et cetera. That slice of pie is the only place where in hard times we can cut. And so what we have seen is the governor, and I have little notes over here, make sure I get these numbers correct. The governor to date for fiscal year 20, which ends at the end of this month, has cut $433 million out of the budget from last year or from this year. It's really substantial. That includes, and I want to make sure I get these numbers correct. Yeah, it was $123 million to the foundation formula for K-12 schools, $7 million out of the transportation line item for our schools. And in the most recent round of cuts, he essentially eliminated June payments to all of our institutions of higher education, so community college and four-year. So that was about a $34 million cut. I think the hope is, and then let me explain this year's budget, which looks different now. This year's budget is about $35 billion. But that's sort of an imaginary number, because what the majority party decided to do was, if you think of it this way, we have all of our typical revenue streams, and then they just kind of placed empty buckets sitting around the budget in case Congress decides to bail out the states. And so when I say that it's a $35 billion budget, there's not $35 billion there. There are places to take that money should Congress appropriate it, and the governor would have spending authority. So the hope is Congress will bail us out, and then we can restore some of the cuts that have been made. But I think we've all seen how dysfunctional Washington is at the moment. I've heard Mitch McConnell say, that we're not going to bail out states. We have definitely, as a state, put ourselves in a position where we need to be bailed out. That's the sad truth. We have mismanaged our budget for 20 years now, and we can't withstand a recession like this. So that's where we're at. That's why K-12 and higher ed are taking the hits that they're taking. They're going to continue to take those hits. It's going to be a really, really tough time for all of education. And so, like I oftentimes say, I feel like I come on these calls or in these meetings, and I feel like, hi, I'm Greg, and I'm the bearer of bad news. But that's the truth of where we sit right now. I would suggest everyone reach out to Congressman Cleaver, to Senator Blunt, to Senator Hawley, and let them know that we need that money from the federal government to protect our schools. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions, Zach.
Zach, we can't hear you.
I had myself muted. It looks like we do have one question that just came in. And it is the person's understanding that Missouri is a state that has a constitutional requirement to balance the budget. There's not much more to that thought, but if you could kind of go through some of the hard decisions that you had to sit through with that reality, and trying to get funds where they needed to be, especially when we're talking about education.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and one that I should have brought up. So thank you for asking that question. We do have a constitutional amendment in Missouri that the legislature has to pass a balanced budget. To do that, there's a series or a group of folks based at the University of Missouri that kind of come up with what we call the consensus revenue estimate for the next fiscal year. They say, you know, this is what the financial trends are looking like. This is how much we think will come in. And we base a budget around that. If trends are or if reality is less than what was predicted, then the governor withholds money because it's his responsibility to keep the budget balanced. So that's why I say when there are those three slices of the budget and they're pretty equal, when money comes in from the federal government, from Congress, they tell us, they say, you know, if you accept this money, this is where it has to go. So if we accept the money, we have to spend it, and we have to spend it where they say. Transportation money, for example, is in the Constitution, that when you pay the gas tax at the pump, that money must go to MoDOT. So the sales tax and income tax is what makes up that third slice of pie. And that's, again, that's education, higher education, social services, our state workforce pay, maintenance on all of our buildings and facilities, all the other things that state government does. That's about $10 billion, and it comes out of that slice of pie. So when you see that we need to make cuts, or when revenue estimates come in, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, our actual revenue comes in hundreds of millions of dollars less than what was anticipated a few months ago, the cuts can only come from that general revenue slice of pie. And so the hard decisions become, you know, I get very mad when education gets cut. So the budget chairman would say, okay, whose Medicaid, healthcare do you want to take away? Okay, how many, if you want to save education, how many state employees do you want to fire? Or do we want to take away their healthcare? Those are the types of questions that get asked. It's very difficult. And the problem is, over the years, we really don't have a rainy day fund. We don't have a big pot of money setting aside. We live year to year, paycheck by paycheck, and we keep giving, you know, huge corporate tax cuts away. And now that we have hit a recession, now that we've hit hard times, we have nothing to fall back on except to cut these programs, services, and education. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, and thank you. And just to clarify, and we'll ask some more questions later when we get through everybody, but just to clarify, there was a question. What was the number on that cut to education in the state of Missouri this fiscal year?
Let me pull that up very quickly. I'm pulling that up right now. It was over 100 million.
Okay.
Come back to me in a second and I'll have that number.
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. And please, I'd like to just encourage everybody to continue putting your questions into the chat. Again, we're going to keep track of that and just kind of pepper in the questions when we can, but also there will be time at the end. But so we can make sure we have that time at the end, we're going to go on to Representative Joe Runyons. And Representative, if you don't mind, we would love to hear from you about issues of healthcare and transportation, but just kind of a personal question. How are you, Representative?
Better. I'm not all the way back yet. I mean, I talked to the gentleman, Jim Foley, yesterday that come down with it the same day I did, and we decided we don't know where we got it, but we got it down there in Jeff City somewhere, and it's a slow road back. I mean, look, I was in session till the 11th or the 12th of March, and then I come home and everything went to hell, so to speak. And I was not cleared until the 42 days later. And then I waited another 2 weeks, so I did make the last week of session, but I'm still not 100%. And I was talking to my friend yesterday, and he said he still has a lot of issues, even though that it's over 3 months. People just don't realize how vicious it is. and it is very important to wear the mask and be socially distancing. And you see everybody doing it, you know, forgetting about that issue. But once you get it, you're tied up at least 3 months or more. I mean, you can get back to where you can do stuff, but the week I was in Jeff City, it was pretty tiring. I did it. Well, you know, we stayed in session and I went home and then rested and come back the next day. But over the weekend, after it was over, I just rested all weekend and the following week. So I am better. And on transportation, we didn't pass a whole lot of stuff. One of them is that we did some, and it kind of falls into the transportation, that we deeded some property in Jefferson City back to the city of Jefferson City from the state, and it's going to improve our ports up and down the river, from all the way from New Orleans to St. Joe and beyond, with new technology and new barges and how they handle them, and it's an excellent move that was passed. And then I'll say something else on transportation. For the first time since I've been down there, we passed a lot of naming highways, memorial highways, and they were all for real this time. They were for people that really deserved them. In the past, we've passed them for people that are still living, or I don't know, some of them was country singers and all that really didn't merit being having a memorial highway. But this year, the chairman made sure that they were all true memorial highways, and that was pretty, you know, that was something we'd all on that committee had worked to get, and we got it accomplished for the first time in 8 years. So that's a good move. And what else did you want to?
If you could talk just briefly about healthcare, if there was any highlights that you saw come through the chamber.
We still aren't getting, I don't think the hospitals are still getting the supplies they really need. I think the testing is misleading. I mean, we should have been testing at this level back in March, not in June, because the numbers would be tremendously higher. I mean, everybody says that 5 out of 10 of the people that get the virus have no symptoms. They go right along and they pass it on to everybody else. And then we just have to, the ones that get it have to live with it. And one thing, and I might want to say, and when Jeremy and I started at the same time, this group of legislators that came in and were sworn in January of 13, it's been completely different than any legislators ever. First, we had our speaker resign in the second year we were down there. Then there was other resignations from different ones. And then the governor had to resign under pressure. And then we have the pandemic. So we've had one hell of a 8-year stretch that I hope nobody else has to ever go through. So any questions?
Representative, we don't see any questions yet. I can tell some folks are typing, but definitely well wishes on your recovery moving forward.
Now, I did see one that come up about TIFs, and there is some changes depending on whether the governor signs Donna Fauci's bill. It will change TIFs tremendously.
And Representative, since you touched on it, would you mind telling us a little bit more about that bill quickly?
I think, and I've seen the highlights of it. What it's going to do is, if there's a TIF or a CID or a transportation sales tax for certain areas or districts, in the CIDs, it'll have to be voted by the people that live in the CID district, but then it will also have to go to a vote of the municipality that covers that district. So if a TIF was put into place in somewhere in Grandview, the people living in that district, which most of the time there is nobody living in there, it's just the owners of the property, but then it would go to the vote of the people of the city of Grandview to approve or disapprove that CID. And as far as I know, that there was a lot of changes, and that's one of them. So it is going to be, and it's going to let school districts, library districts, fire districts opt out of the TIFs also.
Thank you, Representative.
In general.
Yeah, thank you. And I should have said this to kick it off, and maybe I did. To our panelists, don't worry. We have Jeremy and Sam in its back and cleanup at the end, so we'll give them the hardest part of this. We'll continue on. Thank you again, Representative Runyons. We'll continue on to Representative Richard Brown. And Representative Brown, we're interested to hear from you more about kind of the developments in Missouri this session and a few other things around tourism and punitive damages.
Sure. Well, good morning. Can you hear me? I want to make sure I'm unmuted. Can you hear me there? All right. Good morning, everybody. So I think one of the most important things that happened down in Jefferson City was the repeal, or pretty much the passage of Senate Joint Resolution 38, which some of us refer to as Dirty Missouri. What this will do is it seeks to reverse the Clean Missouri redistricting reform that Missouri voters overwhelmingly ratified back in 2018. It would make it difficult, if not impossible, to challenge the unconstitutional redistricting plans, and it creates a one person, one vote standard that could exclude anyone who isn't registered to vote, including children, from being counted when creating new legislative districts. This particular resolution, it passed along party lines for the most part. All the Democrats voted against it. We support the will of the people. There were a handful of Republicans that also joined in to vote against it, but overwhelmingly, the majority of the Republicans, they did vote for its passage. So now it's, once it's signed by the governor, it's going to head to the November ballot. If the Missouri voter, again, wants to ensure that the district lines are drawn based upon a nonpartisan demographer, which is what Clean Missouri stated, that a nonpartisan demographer would be charged with drawing new House and Senate districts based upon constitutional criteria. And it emphasized trying to maximize the numbers of competitive districts. This system was slated to be used for the first time in the upcoming redistricting cycle in 2021. And it will create districts that will be used for the 2022 legislative elections. So we really need the voters to get out and vote again in November. The Republicans, for some reason, they seem to believe that the public didn't know what they were voting on. I argue against that. The voters have said that they wanted their districts drawn a certain way. They wanted to put it into gerrymandering of district lines. And so we just have to see what the voters are going to say in November. As far as tourism, as some of you may not be aware, I am a tourism commissioner for the state of Missouri. So tourism is a little near and dear to me. I do want to piggyback on and go back a little bit on transportation. Representative Runyons had talked about transportation, but one thing that he didn't discuss was House Bill 1963. House Bill 1963 is the bill that allows the Missouri State Highway and Transportation Commission to enter into a public-private partnership to build the Hyperloop, the high-speed tube transportation system but it prohibits the use of eminent domain to acquire property for the project, and it bars funding from the state road fund. I'm very excited about the prospect of having this Hyperloop. We have talked about it for years here in the state of Missouri. I think it would do wonders for tourism. You know, people will come to Missouri just to ride this Hyperloop. You know, one thing that I've ridden in my life is I've ridden a bullet train in Japan, and it's just, wow, it's out of this world. It's just something you have to experience. And this Hyperloop, imagine being able to get from Kansas City to St. Louis in 1 hour. Wow. Or is it 30 minutes? It's some incredible speed. It's just something that I'm looking forward to. So that was a really good transportation bill that had passed. When we talk about tourism, there is some concerns about tourism because, you know, the state began easing the public health restrictions on businesses and daily activities back on May the 4th. But since the coronavirus pandemic has struck, more than 100,000 unemployment claims were filed from workers in the lodging, hospitality, restaurant, and entertainment industries. That's roughly a third of the workers in Missouri's tourism industry. We've seen the local hotel demands decrease since March. Data from Tourism Economics, which is a tourism research company, they have projected that Missouri has lost about $2.16 billion in tourism spending between February and May compared to the same time frame of last year. In a recent meeting with the tourism commissioners, we are hoping to see more travelers from within the state and the surrounding states coming to Missouri by car rather than people flying in to Kansas City or St. Louis. We know that we've lost some conventions, our convention business in Kansas City, St. Louis, and then the Ozark region. Recently, we've seen the new Lowe's Hotel open up here in Kansas City, so that's a positive. We know that the casinos have recently reopened. We're awaiting other attractions to open up, such as Worlds of Fun and Six Flags, other tourist destinations. So we really look forward to those travelers and visitors coming back to Missouri and spending their money here. Okay, and if there's any questions, I'll be more than happy to take those questions.
Absolutely. And Representative, please forgive me, did you touch on punitive damages already?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yes, you did have a question about that. So, this was another bad bill, in my opinion, Senate Bill 591. It will make it substantially harder for injured plaintiffs to collect punitive damages in civil lawsuits. And it makes it more difficult to sue companies in the state of Missouri for alleged wrongdoing under the Missouri Merchandising Practices Act. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not that well in depth with all the specifics when we talk about this particular bill. I do know that in the last 4 years, the majority party, they have really pushed tort reform in the state of Missouri, saying that they thought it would be good for business, but I think it's bad for the consumer because it makes it much harder. There's other barriers, makes it harder to prove your case in court should you be injured by, let's say, a faulty product. And so there was concerns about that. And of course, that bill has gone to the governor's desk, and I'm anticipating that this will probably be signed as other tort reform bills have been signed in the past.
Thank you, Representative. And real quick, we did have a question. We have a little bit of time for you. Following up on the Hyperloop there, and it was a question of, will it be expanded in the future to places like Chicago? But more to the point of how, if it will not be built with eminent domain, how will it be built? Will they offer to buy the property?
And that's a good question. I believe that's the mindset, that they will be purchasing the land or they'll be using existing land that's owned by the state alongside of the interstates. As far as expanding to other places like Chicago, I think that's where the federal government comes in place, because now we're talking about interstate travel. But I am just excited that at least we've gotten a start on this Hyperloop project, and look forward to it coming to Missouri.
Thank you, Representative. And I'm sure we'll have some more questions towards the end. But we'll continue now on to Representative Mark Sharp. And Representative, if you could, talk to us about workforce development in the state and kind of some issues, or not issues, but legislation that really touched on that. I know that was a big topic in last session that the legislature went out, really worked on, but also if you could talk to us about, I know you had Blair's Law that you filed, but you also serve on the Special Committee on Urban Issues, and anything regarding violence in the state or other urban issues.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Zach, and thank you, South Kansas City Chamber. Real quick before I dive into all that, because I'm going to dump a lot on you guys, and not too in a short span. But before I go into that, just want to again I'm glad that Representative Runyons is doing okay, and just to add on to what, or piggyback on what he said earlier, there are so many folks still not wearing masks, and we have just still got to be careful. Just even yesterday, I went to support the Unity March down there at the plaza, and just a lot of folks not social distancing and still don't have masks on, and we have got to be careful. So I just wanted to add that on. Can't forget that we're still trying to navigate this this pandemic. Okay, so today I'm talking about workforce development, crime, and maybe some urban issue stuff. Urban issues didn't see a whole lot of bills, unfortunately, because the pandemic happened, and before anything could really go through there the way we wanted to, there was a lot of hang up with the pandemic. So with workforce development, there was a bill 1511, which would approve professional licensing reciprocity of spouses of active duty members of the armed forces being transferred to Missouri or to an adjacent state if the spouses will be living in Missouri. So this was something that we heard early on in the session, and we knew that was going to be passed. So I think this was a pretty good bill, and just makes it easier for those spouses to be able to transfer those licenses when their spouses are being transferred around. So that was a good bill. And many of us voted yes on that. So, and then for House Bill or House Committee Substitute, really, 2046, approving or allowing persons to apply for professional licensing reciprocity if they had a license in another state for at least 1 year, unless their license had been revoked or is under some kind of investigation, or if there's some kind of a pending complaint. So this bill really makes it simpler for those who have licenses in other states to just transfer their license to Missouri. So again, I think this was a pretty good bill. Anything that makes Missouri more attractive to other people wanting to move here, I think it's a good thing. So that was one thing that I wanted to mention on workforce development. In this bill, it provided a couple of provisions, or included a couple of provisions for Expanded Workforce Access Act and for the Fresh Start Act. On the Expanded Workforce Access Act, it would expand or include provisions requiring Missouri licensing agencies to issue licenses to applicants who have passed the appropriate approved apprenticeship programs and any required exams. So essentially what this bill does is it cuts down the hoops people have to jump through before their license is issued out to them. So again, I think this was a pretty good bill. Again, this was the Expanded Workforce Access Act. The Fresh Start Act, which also had a couple of provisions that were added, which would provide that applicants, for the most part, for most categories of professional licensing in Missouri, cannot be disqualified because of a prior conviction, unless it was directly related to the duties of the licensed profession, or if they were sentenced to incarceration within the last 4 years. So I think this is going to give a lot of folks a better chance at actually having a fresh start, and hopefully we can start seeing some of the results of that paying off here soon. I'm going to jump into crime real quick. This was a real controversial bill the last week of session. Senate Substitute, Senate Bill 600, basically prohibited, it started off just prohibiting probation of suspended imposition of sentencing for second-degree murder, any dangerous felony involving the use of a deadly weapon, or for defendants previously convicted of a dangerous felony. And it also made vehicle hijacking a felony, which it wasn't before. But some of the things that I didn't like on this bill was basically it increased a lot of the mandatory sentences for armed criminal action involving use of a firearm, from 3 years for the first offense to 5 years, from 5 years for the second offense to 15 years, and from 10 years for the third offense to 15 years. So basically, it just really made those sentences longer. One thing I did want to mention, though, it also strengthened the penalties for dangerous felonies committed as part of a street gang activity by adding 5 years to those sentences too. So this was something I voted no on, just because I didn't agree with the sentencing. I don't think that's exactly where I want to go with things, but that's what that bill had included, and that one was passed this year. And then I wanted to mention House Bill 1896. This bill started off just requiring criminal background checks for any employees and owners of medical marijuana facilities. But then as this bill moved along, the list of controlled substances was updated to include fentanyl, and prohibited the sale of edible marijuana-infused products like marketed for youth. So basically, you can't have these edibles, I guess, that look like gummies or gummy bears or something to that effect. So that is all I had really for workforce development and crime. A couple other things I did want to mention real quick before I get off. I did sponsor Blair's Law, and then me, Representative Shore, and Representative, oh man, I'm forgetting his name now. I can't think of his name now, but we presented this bill in the General Laws Committee, and it did pass 12-1. And I think this bill probably would have gotten across the finish line at some point, but we just ran out of time, I think, with that one. One other bill that I did want to mention that I co-sponsored was witness protection. Right now, the state of Missouri doesn't have a witness protection fund. So if you're in a federal case, you can be approved for witness protection, but in the state of Missouri, that is not the case. And a few other states have this, and I was kind of hoping that this would get further along, but I hope to co-sponsor this again next year. So I'm not sure if there's any questions, but I'll try to answer it.
Thank you, Representative. And we did actually have a question come in, and it was start off with a statement that it doesn't see how someone could benefit from having a fresh start if they have to wait for 4 years. And they would like to know, does that include marijuana offenses? And will there be expungement of people's records now that we have medical marijuana legal? Any insight or thoughts on that?
Well, in my opinion, I believe that any marijuana offense, for the most part, shouldn't be included in that. But I have to double check on that, and maybe this person can give me the information. I can double check on that and get it to the group. But 4 years, it is a while. I mean, that is a while. But there's also a whole lot of folks out there who have been out of prison or out of jail for much longer than that, who are still feeling some of the strain from not being able to get those licenses the way they as fast as they should. And I don't think this is the silver bullet to this issue, but I also do believe that this does help some. So it's a step in the right direction, and hopefully, as time goes on, we can change it from 4 years to a shorter time.
Can I jump in there, Zach, for just a second on the expungement? So last year, I worked with Representative Ron Hicks on a medical marijuana expungement bill, which would have expunged those convictions of persons with simple marijuana offenses. This would not have included driving under the influence or selling marijuana. It was just simple possession. Again, we tried to work on that this year, but because of COVID-19, we just couldn't get to it. But we did pass it last year out of the House. But again, last year, it ran out of time when it got over to the Senate. So we're going to go back in again. We're going to look at this next year. But yes, we are aware down at the State House and in the legislature that that is an issue. And so if we can get this passed, those persons that do have in their possession a medical marijuana card, they could apply. It won't be automatic, but they would have to apply to have those records and convictions expunged. And let me also point out something. My colleague here, Mr. Sharp, he's kind of modest. In the future, you're going to see cars driving around our state. You know, I'm a big tourism guy. You're going to see cars driving around the state with these Negro League Baseball Museum license tags on them. That was Mark Sharp. He brought that bill to the House. He was able to get it attached to another bill as an amendment. It was passed, and it's off to the governor's desk. Hopefully it'll be signed into law, and we will see those Negro League Baseball Museum tags on cars. So great job, Mark. Really proud of the job that you did this year. Now at the legislature, for a rookie, he came out swinging, and he did a great job down there.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Rich.
Well, thank you, Representative Brown, and thank you, Representative Sharp. And as promised, we do have the illustrious, the glorious, the ever so knowledgeable lobbyists with us here that represent both chambers down in the state capitol, and I'm sure knock on these gentlemen's doors more than they would like to see them. We have none other than Jeremy Lefevre and Sammy Pianettieri from State Line Strategies here to kind of really help us wrap everything up. But before we get to a good wrap up, could you tell us a bit about what happened with key pieces of legislation and priorities for the chambers like PDMP and Wayfair?
You bet. Thanks, guys. I'll just dive right in. I'm going to cover the Wayfair bill. As many of you are aware, there's an effort to require companies to charge sales tax on online purchases where they're not required right now. That had a lot of momentum, and it's got almost universal support. People want to level the playing field for local businesses, and I think there's unanimous support for that. Where it got tricky was what to do with the revenue when it came in. And there are a handful of lawmakers in the Senate, mostly from St. Charles County, that are adamant that no new revenue come into the state. And in fact, they were adamant that any Wayfair bill had to be a $100 million tax cut. And so a lot of members of their own party, and certainly the Democratic Party, were not supportive of that. And so that bill had a hard time getting through. I think at the very end, they tried to tie it to an effort to pass a cable franchise fee elimination. And so the cities would get the revenue from Wayfair, but they wouldn't get the money from the cable franchise fee. And so it would be a revenue neutral proposal for the cities, but it was still a $100 million tax cut for the state. So that didn't pass. There's a lot of talk of a special session on the Wayfair issue. The general consensus, or conventional wisdom, I think is better phrase, is that could be called in conjunction with the veto session that happens in the second week of September. And so they would come back, and there's not much energy or effort around a veto session anymore. That the governor and the legislature, the same party, but they would have time potentially to do a special session. That's where the governor can limit the call. And so he could limit it, some argued, to where they couldn't even discuss a tax cut. What that would do, particularly in a election year with those senators from St. Charles County, I'm not sure how. I don't know what it would do to them, and whether they would allow that through. But we're kind of stuck. Missouri is one of, I think Florida's the only other state that hasn't passed the Wayfair fix. I will say, while Wayfair is certainly important from a leveling the playing field, the 10 largest online retailers in America all collect sales tax in the state of Missouri. Walmart, Amazon, Wayfair, even collect sales tax in Missouri. And so the revenue estimates of how much would come in are years old. And since that time, all of these companies have started collecting and remitting the tax already. And so when we get into those discussions of tax cuts, that's why the tax cut was so large, is because most of the revenue from online sales is already coming in. It's not coming in to all the municipalities if they have a use tax. It is. So Jackson County, the money's coming in. Sorry, my phones came out. That's the scoop with Wayfair. We'll wait to see what the governor's going to do. I know a couple people are working on a new revenue estimate for what it would bring in, and when we have that, I will be sure to share it with everybody. Sam, you want to talk about PDMP?
Yeah, let me cover
things?
PDMP. I think Jeremy covered probably the biggest issue that was kind of a swing and a miss for the legislature this year, and unfortunate didn't get done on passing the Wayfair fix, both from a state and municipal perspective, with diminishing revenues because of the COVID shutdown, and then increased online sales purchases. So, and real quickly, just to Jeremy's point, yeah, some municipalities have the use tax in place, some of them don't. Some have tried to pass it on the ballot, and some have failed. So the kind of final proposal there that was offered, that was a certain cut with cable franchise fees, didn't really seem to equal out. So people weren't very thrilled about that. Kind of same with PDMP. PDMP, was once again sponsored by Champion Representative Holly Reeder from Southeast Missouri. The House got to work on it early again, passed it out very soon in session. The Senate took it up, had if I remember right, it seems like 10 years ago, almost an overnight discussion and negotiation on it. They made some modifications to the bill that had originally passed the House. And before the COVID shutdown, the Senate actually sent that bill back with Senate amendments, and it just kind of sat there on the calendar without action. A lot of people anticipated that it was just going to be taken up and passed when the legislature returned to work on the supplemental budget, but that didn't take place. So it kind of lingered, and then kind of, towards the end of session, the final 3 weeks, when we had that kind of mini session at the end, it seemed more of a negotiating tool than a proposal that was going to get serious consideration. There were nonetheless still attempts. It went to conference, and there were some modifications made. Those weren't weren't going to pass muster in the Senate again. So when that conference report was brought to the Senate, it was immediately filibustered, as it was anticipated, for a couple hours. So no more time on that. And unfortunately, the House leadership, floor leader, elected not to bring that proposal back up for consideration. So a lot of work was done early. Thought it certainly was closer than it ever was before, but almost like with the Wayfair fix, where a lot of the big online retailers are now already voluntarily collecting the sales tax. With PDMP, the trade-off is estimates are up to 87% of the state is covered already under the St. Louis County PDMP. So, that's still in place. And so I think the proponents of it weren't willing to give that up, and are comfortable there, and didn't want to make further concessions, I guess, to the PDMP bill to get it across the finish line. So I'm not very sure that that's going to actually be something that's really back with a lot of fervor next year. Wayfair, like Jeremy said, Missouri and Florida are the only ones without it. PD&P, as you know, Missouri is the only one in the country without it, but I'm not sure there's going to be the same momentum for it next year necessarily. For one thing, champion Holly Reeder is running for election for the Senate, so we'll see how that race turns out. But I'm not sure that the House dynamics there are going to allow for it to move forward or not, but that's kind of to be continued. So we'll see about that. A couple other things real quick I'll address that some of your good representatives here have kind of touched on.
Hey, Sam.
Yeah.
Just to jump in real quick, there was a question on the line. PD&P is a prescription drug monitoring program.
Yes.
And it would, so.
Yeah, it's the Narcotic Control Act. It would establish a prescription drug monitoring program, allowing, providers to share information and law enforcement as well, so that they can try to stop excessive distribution of opioids, particularly. So, but let me move on real quick. So in addition to Wayfair, PD&P were kind of some of the big misses. I think there's a couple other ones. Mark Sharp mentioned Witness Protection Relocation Fund. That bill, that provision was actually something that was on a bill towards the end of session. Jack, I'm on a conference call. Sorry. It was something that was broadly supported. I think it passed both committees unanimously. What it was the mayors of the largest cities in the state and the governor getting together, trying to find solutions to reduce the crime problem. One of the biggest problems with getting some of the folks who commit these crimes convicted is witnesses seem to understandably kind of fall off the radar when it comes time for trial because they're in fear of those individuals. Witness Protection Relocation Fund was going to put $1 million into Department of Public Safety to be dispersed to, KCPD or other jurisdictions to put those folks who were going to be witnesses into temporary housing at least, or provide security for them until a trial was done. I think that is something that will be tackled. There's been a little bit of discussion about potential for that in a special. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to happen, but I think that the governor and the mayor still want it, and I think the legislature was pretty supportive of it. It just was a matter kind of a collateral damage with the shutdown and the loss of time in the legislature. One other thing I think the legislature missed on, the majority party didn't seem to want to take up or advance the reforms on low-income housing tax credits. Affordable housing is a continuing issue. In Missouri, there's well over 100,000 people on the waiting list to get affordable housing. I assume that number's increased dramatically since the COVID-19 shutdown. The Senate took action on it. Again, kind of the proposal that they were able to pass last year. Once again, the House did not take it up. There's rumors that Governor Parson may elect to turn the program back on without the legislative reforms. I mean, in his defense, he's kind of given legislative leadership a couple of sessions now to enact the reforms that they've said that they'd like to see since former Governor Greitens shut the program off. They haven't made any progress in that regard. So, it's kind of expected that Governor Parson, who's been a proponent of, low-income housing tax credits, could turn that on over the summer. So we'll kind of look at that. One last thing, and I'll get off here so we can go to questions. I'm looking back through House Bill 1854, Representative Runyon's. I do not see that the TIF provision survived on that bill. It did reform CIDs and TDDs. And as you said, rather than just the folks in the established district voting, it would take wherever that special taxing district was formed, it would take a vote of the entire municipality to establish and raise taxes on that in that way. So don't see any TIF reforms on there. I know there were some moving around in the legislative session. I think the bills that they were on didn't cross the finish line, but it was very hard to keep track of, obviously, with the shortened session and the massive omnibus bills. But Donna Fauch's bill that you mentioned only applies to CIDs and TDDs. So just wanted to clear that up.
Thank you, Sammy and Jeremy, both. Obviously, it was a busy session, even in a shortened session, with having that gap there. One thing I do want to go back to, Representative Razor had gotten a question about what the cut was to education, and to date, the governor has withheld 123 million from the foundation formula. And the foundation formula, please jump in to correct me, is really the base for a lot of public schools around the state and what they get to provide education to their students. And in addition to that, 127 million or $23 million cut is another $7 million cut to transportation lines for K-12. So that obviously getting students to school, and that gets us to that $130 million withhold from the governor after the legislative session.
Hey, Zach.
Yes.
On that piece, in addition, the governor, there's a statute called hold harmless, and I don't know all the hold harmless districts, but my guess is there are some in South Kansas City, that anytime revenues are reduced, a hold harmless district is saved from those cuts. So in a normal situation, hold harmless districts wouldn't see a cut from that $132 million. But the governor waived the statute that allows for hold harmless districts. And so hold harmless districts that traditionally would not be impacted by foundation formula cuts are going to be impacted by foundation formula cuts now.
That's an important distinction. Thank you, Jeremy. And kind of staying on the line of education, this is open to any of the panelists who are free to jump in or want to jump in. There's a question of, were there any bills around STEM, or we've seen that acronym change to STEAM sometimes as well with education bills. Did we see any of that in the legislature this session that made it past the finish line or almost?
I know, I'll jump in on that. I know on the higher education committee, we took a look at a couple of bills that dealt with it in various different ways because of the COVID shutdown of the legislature. They never really got past the committee point. So I think there was some good intentions and some movement that was ready to be there, but we just didn't have time this year.
Thank you, Representative. We also have another question in a similar vein of, were there any bills that addressed the environment in any sort of way?
I'll jump back in there then. I know Representative Don Roan, who is down in the Boot Hill, he had a biodiesel bill that would use, was it soybeans? I'm looking at, yes, Amy's nodding yes. Using soybeans in our diesel production to make a blend product. It burns cleaner, it's better for engines of trucks and whatnot. It would have helped farmers across the state, but in particular down in southeast Missouri. That bill I know passed the House, and I don't know if it got to the Senate for the governor's office. It did not, but that was from what I can remember, kind of the one and only bill that dealt with the environment that kind of got a vote in the House.
This is Jeremy. The Grain Belt Express, that's the renewable wind energy transmission line that would go across northern Missouri. There was an effort by the speaker to stop that project, and those bills died. And so, at least at this point, that project continues to move forward.
Thanks, Jeremy. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so if we could just, I don't know what a virtual thank you looks like, but a virtual thank you to the representatives that joined us, Representative Richard Brown, Greg Razor, Joe Runyons, and Mark Sharp, and not to be forgotten, Jeremy LaFavor and Sammy Pianetary, who put all of these gentlemen put on the armor and go down and represent South Kansas City and Grandview chambers each legislative session. And before we go, I do have a couple of announcements for everybody. First off, if we didn't get to your question, just for the interest of time, please feel free to go to house.mo.gov. That is where you can find each representative's information, as well as what they have worked on, and other representatives from the area and ways to contact them. I know we had some more questions about STEM, Representative Razor, that I know that some folks might be reaching out to you about. But we have coming up here, just want to make this important announcement. We have a webinar called The Impact of COVID-19 on Economic Development. And that will be next Thursday, June 11th, from 11:30 to 12:30. And we're going to just kind of connect with some economic development leaders from around the state. So that will include the Missouri Department of Economic Development Director, Rob Dixon, Tim Cowden, the President and CEO of the KCADC, which is the Kansas City Area Development Council, Mark Long, President and CEO of Newmark Brew Zimmer, and Owen Buckley, President of Lane Ford, to kind of give us that really look at what has happened since COVID and what does economic development look like in the midst of COVID. I would be remiss not to also mention that if you just Google Evergy COVID response, I know that this webinar this morning was powered by Evergy, and I hope we got everybody reconnected after the storms last night. And but one thing that we're doing in the community as well is we've pledged $2.2 million in local COVID relief, and that goes from anything from emergency grants to nonprofits on the front lines, to hometown economic recovery, our hometown economic recovery program. So, like I said, please, if you Google Evergy COVID relief, it'll be the first thing to pop up. You can learn more about that to find out how that $2.2 million can help your organization and your community. And one final announcement is we will likely see some of these faces back when we get to June, next month. I'm losing myself with time being relative here, or July, excuse me. So in July, we're going to have a candidate forum for the folks who are running for the August primary. So we'll see some familiar faces, and we'll have more information about that coming later. Again, I just want to thank the panelists and thank you for joining us this morning, and to all the attendees that stayed on to listen to what happened in your state capital. We appreciate you. Thanks again on behalf of the Grandview Chamber and the South Kansas City Chamber, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, Zach.
Absolutely.